Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming. How many came at 5 o'clock and have been waiting for a while to be here? Oh, let's give them all a hand. We apologize for that. We are here today, of course, tonight, to discuss the scientific evidence for God in biology and science. And we have with us Dr. P.Z. Myers from the Minnesota Morris campus. And thank you for being here. And he's the author of The Happy Atheist. And we also have with us Dr. Fuz Rana from Reasons to Believe Ministry and the author of The Cell's Design, who will be sharing first. We had a coin toss, and Fuz will be speaking first. We are going to begin right away because of our time. And each speaker will have 30 minutes, and then we'll have a 20-minute rebuttal, you might say, for this discussion, and then we're going to give the audience an opportunity. So how many of you received a little book coming in here? Okay. Did you find a card in that book, and did you get a pencil as you came in? You can write your question, and anytime during the questions might occur to you, and it's good to write them down. And if you can indicate you have something you'd like to ask either of the authors and speakers tonight, I will collect these. Or if you feel more comfortable on your feet with a mic, that will be provided at the very end as well. And so we just ask you to keep your comments, no speeches or any other presentations, just two presenters tonight. But if you have a short question, either format, the card or the mic, you're more than welcome to address one of our speakers with a question. So I want to, again, thank you. My name is Darrell Lindensmith. I'm the pastor of the Seventh-day Adventist Church here in town, and this is the organization that has sponsored this evening. So why don't we all begin by giving both our speakers a round of applause for being here. Thank you. Is this mic good? Can you hear me all? No, okay. I see, there we go. Is it just me not close to it? How's that, a little better? Okay, very good. We will begin with Dr. Rana. Thank you, Fuz.
Well, good evening, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here with you tonight. Thank you so much for coming and braving the cold weather, but I guess for you, this is just normal weather. But for me, from Southern California, this is pretty much a nightmare. So anyway, it's, again, really a pleasure to be here, and I really appreciate the hard work that Darrell and his team undertook to make this event possible, and it really is an honor to share the platform with Dr. Myers. And so we should have a good time tonight talking about the question whether or not God exists and what can we learn about the likelihood of God's existence from the area of biology. And I'm going to be affirming God's existence, and I'm going to be focusing primarily in the arena of biochemistry and in the area of origin of life research, because that's where my training is. And before I get into my presentation this evening, however, I want to give you a little bit of background information just about who I am, so you kind of have an understanding of how I arrived at this particular position that I hold. When I was an undergraduate student, I was an agnostic. If you ask me, did God exist, I very well could have said, yes, God exists, but I also was living in the Bible Belt at that time, growing up in West Virginia, and it was kind of a fashionable thing to say that you gave a nod to God's existence, but in my heart of hearts, I had really no idea if God existed or not, and really, honestly, could care less. When I was an undergraduate student, my sole focus was preparing myself to go to graduate school to study biochemistry. And so I was immersed in my coursework, chemistry and biology. I was really a science nerd through and through as an undergraduate student. And again, was an agnostic. I took courses in biology and chemistry, and the professors that I had taught that life's origin and life's history could be explained through evolutionary means. I had no problem with that idea. In fact, at some level, those notions fueled my agnosticism and my skepticism to some degree as to whether or not God exists. And I remember in college having friends who were Christians. I didn't grow up in a Christian home. I had friends who were Christians, and they would share their faith with me. And I would think to myself, this is just really sounds ridiculous to me. And I liked them, but I kind of felt sorry for them that they held that particular perspective. So here I am. I'm off to graduate school, and I'm studying biochemistry in earnest, taking advanced coursework, reading the scientific literature on a regular basis, beginning to do my own research, interacting with other students about their work, and began to appreciate, first and foremost, just how complex biochemical systems are. But that wasn't really what was arresting to me. It was actually the elegance and the sophistication and the ingenuity of how biochemical systems are structured and how they functioned. And I began to ask myself, how do scientists explain where these systems come from? And of course, the explanation was chemical evolution. And so I began to dig into the scientific literature, just mostly curious as how do you mechanistically explain where biochemical systems come from. And after spending some time reading the literature, I was not really very impressed, to be frank, and felt like the outworkings of chemistry and physics were inadequate to be able to account for the origin of biochemistry, and hence the origin of life question. And it was at that instance that I became convinced that there must be a mind that undergirded life. There must be a creator of some sort. Now, I'm a scientist, and that was the God hypothesis, if you will, that God is responsible for bringing life into existence. And so over the last 30 years, I've put that idea to the test practically on a daily basis, looking at new things that are being discovered in biochemistry, looking at work that's happening in origin of life research. And I'm more convinced today than ever that there must be a creator that brought life into existence. And if I had a couple of hours to make my opening statement, but of course I don't, I would actually present what I would hope to be a comprehensive argument for my viewpoint by pointing out that advances in biochemistry allow us today to make a revitalized Watchmaker argument for God's existence. I would point out that we currently have no viable explanation for the origin of biochemistry or the origin of life. I would talk about work in synthetic biology, where one of the goals is to create artificial organisms and artificial synthetic biochemical systems. And this work, time and time again, highlights the central role intelligent agency plays in bringing about, again, the origin of biochemical systems and the origin of protocells. I would talk about the fact that in nanoscience and nanotechnology, much of the insight that is used to drive the construction of these nanomachines that everybody is focusing on comes from biochemistry itself, understanding the structure and function of the cell's chemical systems, and that the fact that these systems provide that insight and that understanding and inspire the engineering work happening in that area, again, suggests to me that these systems are designed. And then a new idea that is beginning to emerge in the last few years is the prospect that there actually may be a biochemical anthropic principle. I think some of you may be familiar with the cosmological anthropic principle, the idea that the universe is uniquely fit for life, and that fitness is manifested in the form of the fine-tuning of the fundamental constants that define the universe. Well, there is some work that's beginning to happen and some new discoveries that are happening in terms of the way biochemical systems are structured that suggest that this idea may actually extend into the realm of biochemistry. It's a very interesting idea. But alas, I don't have 2 hours. I only have right now 25 minutes. And so what I'm going to do tonight is only focus on 2 of these lines of argumentation. The first 2 that I described, namely that advances in biochemistry allow us to make a revitalized Watchmaker argument for God's existence, and that, again, there is not a viable explanation for the origin of life from a chemical evolutionary standpoint. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at the first argument. And one of the things that I find rather interesting as a biochemist is that the defining features of biochemical systems, the hallmark features of these systems, are identical to the characteristics that we would recognize as evidence for the work of a human designer. In other words, when human beings design, when we create, when we invent objects and devices and systems, these have certain properties that reflect the work of a mind. And it's intriguing to me that when we look at the hallmark characteristics of biochemical systems, they share these same features. And so by analogy, if certain features reflect the work of a human mind, and we see those same features, again, manifested in the cell's chemical systems, is this not evidence for the work of a divine mind? In a sense, it's a watchmaker type argument. And I'm going to illustrate that argument by talking about the information systems in the cell. Now, I would contend that at its essence, biochemistry is an information system. And that our common experience is that information comes from a mind. Whenever we encounter information, no matter the format or what have you, we recognize immediately that a mind is responsible for producing that information. And as I mentioned, biochemical systems at their essence are information systems. The two most prominent information harboring molecules in the cell would be the nucleic acids, DNA and RNA, and then proteins. But there are other information harboring systems. Oligosaccharides, for example, are information systems. Some people have argued that the composition of cell membranes contains information. It's compositional information. In fact, there's a whole origin of life model about the origin of cell membranes that is predicated on that particular idea. And so that in and of itself is provocative, that again you see this information content inside the cell. But that isn't really the argument. The argument is much deeper than that, because the information is organized and structured in the way that we would organize and structure information. For example, information theorists who have worked on problems in molecular biology have noted that there is a correspondence between the way in which human language is organized in a hierarchical fashion and in the way in which biochemical information is organized. In other words, biochemical information seems to be organized in the same way that we would organize information in human language. In fact, a few years ago, a team of researchers developed a biochemical grammar for what are known as antimicrobial peptides. These are small proteinaceous materials that will kill microorganisms. And once they had this grammar in place, they applied it to develop novel antimicrobial peptides. And so the point here is that, again, they were dealing in terms of language as they were characterizing and applying their understanding of biochemical systems. Even more provocative is the recent recognition that the enzymes that manipulate DNA during DNA replication and transcription are fundamentally operating in the same way that a computer system functions at its most foundational level. And to appreciate this, we need to think about the work of British mathematician Alan Turing. Alan Turing has become somewhat of a household name thanks to the movie The Imitation Game, which is a biopic of Alan Turing's work during World War II, where he played the central role in solving the German Enigma code, and is credited with perhaps even accelerating the end of the war by about 2 years because of his work, saving about 14 million lives. Turing built a computer system, built the first computer system to crack the Enigma code. And this computer system that he built was based on theoretical work that he did prior to World War II. He's considered the father of computer science. And his theoretical, the core of his theoretical ideas were something he called a Turing machine, which is a machine that consists of 3 parts: an input, an output, and what's called a finite control. And this is a cartoon showing a Turing machine, where the input is essentially a string of data, and then the finite control is a machine that will alter that data in a prescribed manner, producing an output. And that machine can only alter the data in a very limited way, but Turing's genius was to realize that the output of one Turing machine could be the input of another Turing machine, and on and on and on. And so you could combine very simple operations together to form very complex computations. And this is, again, what he did when he built a computer system to crack the German Enigma code. Well, what's provocative is that, again, the enzymes that are manipulating DNA are, in effect, Turing machines. And this is a cartoon showing DNA replication where you have the DNA double helix being replicated into two daughter helices, and this is a cartoon, so the enzymes are represented by donuts and balls and blobs and things like that. But these are essentially taking the DNA as input, altering the DNA, and then producing output. And then another enzyme comes along and takes the DNA as input and then generates an output. And by working collaboratively, these enzymes that can only perform very limited operations collectively can perform a complex computation, namely replicating DNA. And so again, the DNA is the input and the output, and the enzymes are the finite control. Now, this similarity is so profound that it actually has inaugurated an entire new area of nanotechnology called DNA computing. In fact, this area is now about 20 years old. It was invented by Leonard Adleman, who is a computer scientist at the University of Southern California. And again, the idea here is that you're using DNA and enzymes in a test tube to function as computer systems. And this is what Leonard Adleman said in an interview. The most important thing about DNA computing is that it shows that DNA molecules can do what we normally think only computers can do. This implies that computer science and biology are closely related, that every living thing can be thought to be computing something, and that sometimes we can understand living things better by looking at them as computers. Again, very provocative in terms of an argument for God's existence in the Watchmaker argument. One other point to bring up along these lines is work done by Donald MacDonald at Trinity University in Dublin, Ireland, who a few years ago recognized that instantiated in the DNA molecule is what's known as an even bit parity code, which is a technique that computer scientists use to detect error in data transmission. And again, the point here is this, is the profound similarity between the way in which we structure and manipulate information and the way in which the cell has organized its information. Again, there's a remarkable identity. And this brings us to the Watchmaker argument, which was an idea advanced by the British natural theologian William Paley in the late 1700s. And Paley presents one of the most well-known arguments for God's existence, where he argued that a watch requires a watchmaker, therefore life requires a creator. And in Paley's day, a watch was the pinnacle of engineering achievement. And Paley argued that a watch has certain properties that reflect the work of a mind, and that when you look at biological systems, they have those same properties, and therefore he argued that they must be the work of a mind as well. And so, applying this reasoning, again, to information systems in the cell, a computer system arguably would be the pinnacle of our engineering achievement today, and we know that computer systems come from the work of a mind, and the fact that we now see that at its core, the DNA metabolic systems are, in effect, computer systems, so much so that we can develop computers around the DNA molecule, suggests that they too must be the work of a mind. If you want more information on how this particular line of argumentation works in a more comprehensive sense, I would just point you to my book, The Cell's Design. Now, if I was in Dr. Meyer's shoes, the first thing that I would bring up is the fact that we have a mechanism that can explain the elegant designs of biochemical systems. And that there is a watchmaker, but that watchmaker is a blind watchmaker. And this is how this idea was articulated by Richard Dawkins in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, where Dawkins says, Paley had a proper reverence for the complexity of the living world, and he saw that it demands a very special kind of explanation. The only thing he got wrong was the explanation itself. The true explanation had to wait for Charles Darwin. And then Dawkins goes on to say, natural selection, the blind, unconscious, automatic process which we now know is the explanation for the existence and the apparently purposeful form of all life, has no purpose in mind. It has no mind and no mind's eye. It does not plan for the future. It has no vision, no foresight, no sight at all. It can be said to play the role of the watchmaker in nature, but it is the blind watchmaker. And in effect, when I was a graduate student, this is where I began my quest to understand where biochemical systems come from, where I turned to chemical evolution with the thought that chemical evolution is going to be able to explain these types of systems. I just wanted to know the details, the mechanisms for how that works. But what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is argue that this is not the case whatsoever, that we do not have a viable explanation for the origin of biochemistry from a chemical evolutionary standpoint. Now, when it comes to the origin of life question, I think it's a fair thing to say that there isn't an explanation for the origin of life. I can't imagine any origin of life researcher who's actually immersed in this area of work who would say anything other than that we have no explanation for the origin of life. But I'm not going to go down that path as I make my case for a creator, because that, is, in effect, is a God of the gaps argument. But rather what I'm going to focus on is the success that origin of life researchers have had and show how that success actually demonstrates the role of intelligent agency, not chemical evolution, as a way to explain the origin of biochemical systems. Now, when it comes to origin of life research, origin of life researchers cannot go back in time, obviously, and observe what happened when life originates. There are some clues that we can get from the geochemical record and the fossil record. We have geochemical evidence that suggests life was present on the Earth as far back as 3.8 billion years ago. So there is a record that we can go to for clues. But most of the work in trying to understand the origin of life is done in a laboratory, where scientists are trying to recapitulate the different steps in what they think to be origin of life scenarios. And the idea is that if we can recapitulate those steps in the lab, maybe we can piece together some kind of plausible scenario for how life would originate. And the fact of the matter is, over the last 60 years, there's been some pretty significant accomplishments when it comes to work in what's called prebiotic chemistry. Scientists have been able to build virtually every building, been able to make virtually every building block in the laboratory utilizing likely chemical reactions that could have taken place on the early Earth. They've been able to assemble biomolecules, been able to evolve RNA molecules in the test tube that can perform a wide range of functions. They've been able to generate self-replicating systems, assemble vesicles, manufacture protocells. And so this is a rather impressive set of accomplishments that on the surface seems to indicate that we might be very well on our way to understanding how life originated through chemical evolution. But I'm going to argue that this is actually a false success, because this work is conducted in a laboratory setting where you have carefully controlled conditions. Researchers are careful to set up the experiment in such a way to ensure success. They add the right components at the right time. They are careful to exclude any kind of compound or material that could interfere with those reactions. They stop reactions at the just right time. And as a result of that, they have identified, again, plausible chemical and physical processes that in principle could contribute to the origin of life, but they've done so under highly artificial conditions. As soon as you begin to try to imagine how to translate that chemistry to the conditions of the early Earth, you no longer have productive chemistry that would take place. And so this chemistry is not, in a sense, relevant to the origin of life question, because it would not be productive under the conditions of the early Earth. And the fact of the matter is that these chemical processes are only successful because intelligent agents, that is organic chemists, have rigged the system to ensure success. And I'll illustrate this with the RNA World scenario. This is one of the leading ideas when it comes to explaining the origin of life, and I'm not going to get into the details of it, other than just simply to say the idea here is that the very first biochemistry was RNA-based, and that later this RNA world gave rise to the DNA protein world that we're familiar with today when it comes to life on Earth. Now, there's a number of lines of evidence that origin of life researchers will point to in support of the RNA world hypothesis. One of the most important pieces of evidence is the work done in a laboratory showing that RNA can be assembled on clay surfaces starting with RNA building blocks. And I can remember when this work was first published in the mid-90s, it was heralded as a huge breakthrough in understanding the origin of life. And the idea would be that on the earlier surface, there would be mineral surfaces that could concentrate prebiotic molecules, the building block materials, let's say, for RNA, and then the clay would not only concentrate it, but then serve as a catalytic surface to drive the formation of RNA polymers. The problem is that when you examine the work in detail, you immediately realize that this, again, is an artificial success because the researchers that do this work are very careful to exclude materials that would either inhibit chain growth or would promote the hydrolysis of the RNA chains. They stop the growth of the RNA polymers before they become too long. If the polymer becomes too long, it will be irreversibly absorbed on the clay surface. And of course, you don't have that luxury on the early Earth of eliminating interfering materials or materials that would promote RNA breakdown. You don't have the luxury of stopping chain growth before it becomes irreversibly absorbed on the clay surface. Moreover, in order for the reactions to work, you have to get clay from a specific source. It has to be treated in a specific way before it can function as a catalyst. And then the building block materials have to be chemically activated so that they're poised to react. In other words, this experiment is successful because, again, intelligent agents were involved. This is how Paul Davies describes the problem in his book, The Fifth Miracle. Paul Davies is a physicist and an astrobiologist who has interest in the origin of life question. He says this: as far as biochemists can see, it is a long and difficult road to produce efficient RNA replicators from scratch. This conclusion has to be that without a trained organic chemist on hand to supervise, nature would be struggling to make RNA from a dilute soup under any plausible prebiotic conditions. Evolutionary biologist Simon Conway Morris goes one step further when he says, many of the experiments designed to explain one or other step in the origin of life are either of tenuous relevance to any believable prebiotic setting or involve an experimental rig in which the hand of the researcher becomes, for all intents and purposes, the hand of God. And so the idea here is that work in prebiotic chemistry that is in effect designed to understand how chemical evolution could produce the very first life forms, ironically, is actually making a case for the necessary role of intelligent agency in bringing about the origin of life. If you want more details on, again, this whole area, my book, Creating Life in the Lab, is something you might find interesting. So again, what we've argued here tonight is that advances in biochemistry allow us to make a revitalized Watchmaker argument for God's existence, and that, again, there's not a viable explanation for the origin of biochemistry from a chemical evolutionary standpoint. And I think the conclusion that I arrived at 30 years ago as a graduate student is still a valid conclusion, that there is a creator that exists and that brought life into existence. Okay, that's my opening remarks. Thank you very much.
So let me just start by saying that this is a peculiar situation for me. I'm kind of a reluctant debater. And the only reason I'm here is that Daryl is so gosh darn polite and persistent. But here I am. There are a couple reasons, though, that I'm a reluctant debater, and I got to get those across first. One reason is that debate is not how scientists resolve differences of opinion. You might find a few examples from back in the 19th century, deep in the history of science, but in general, nowadays, when a scientist finds himself on stage with an opponent, it's usually because an advocate for a fringe position is begging that their ideas be judged as credible enough to discuss. Theology and politics are resolved. They're hashed over in debate, but science is resolved in the court of observation and experiment. Second reason, debates never seem to decide anything. I have no illusions at all that the Christian members of this audience will find my arguments at all persuasive. I really don't expect that any of you will just say, oh, forget Jesus, I'm an atheist now, right? I bet you none of you are planning on this, and I think you're safe. I don't think I'll convert you. And likewise, I know that there's a few atheists in the audience here, and I'm pretty sure that even though Dr. Rana might be this rakishly handsome, golden-tongued devil, he's not going to convince you that God exists, right? So this is kind of a strange format in which to have this discussion, because we're not really going to persuade anybody. We have firmly held opinions that aren't going to be switched around by some old guy standing up at a lectern and lecturing at you. So all I can hope to do is share a little bit of what I know with you, and I hope it will trigger some of you to do deeper study of the subject. And third, here's the big one. Because scientists don't debate, we never get training in it. Seriously. Not once in my graduate or postdoctoral training or in 25 years as a professor have I ever done a debate in an academic setting. I haven't even seen one put on at a science conference. It just doesn't happen. It was important for us in those days to get training in presenting science in talks, in papers, but debate, nope, no debating. We just didn't do it. So you'll have to appreciate that I'm not very good at it. Again, all I can do is use this stage as a platform to present a few ideas. But there's another reason I find debates like this to be an exercise in futility. And this is going to crush Dr. Rana, but I've already won. We're done. As nice and persuasive as Dr. Rana may be to you, nothing he says will influence the scientific consensus. It's settled. Evolution works. Evolution is the tool we use in the laboratory in the field to analyze the history of life on Earth. I'm sorry, creationism doesn't do it. There's no information there. So what will happen is after this debate, all the scientists will shrug and, well, they won't even do that because they won't even notice this. They'll go back to working in the lab, publishing papers, doing experiments, making observations that, as they have for the last century and a half, continuously confirm the theory of evolution. So yeah, see exercise in futility. I mean, it's fun to talk about these things with people, but it's not going to happen that we change anyone's minds, or in particular, most importantly, that we change the minds of any scientists. Okay. Another issue here is that I also know exactly how this debate will go. Seriously, I haven't trained professionally as a debater, but I have been to creationist debates before, and I'm very familiar with this. And I wrote all this up ahead of time, and I know exactly what Dr. Rana is going to say. It's like the gift of prophecy. Although it's not. There's a set of familiar arguments that I'm very comfortable with. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little story, a little parable to explain what's going to happen. So many years ago, I was in Washington, D.C., and as I usually do, I found an excuse to visit the museums on the mall. Now, as a biologist, I always make a beeline straight for the Smithsonian. Air and Space Museum, Art Museum, forget those. I go where the biology is, okay? Dinosaurs, fossils, all that cool stuff. That's what I'm really into. But this one time, I thought, as a good liberal arts professor, I ought to broaden my horizons. I ought to look at something different. And so I actually went to the National Portrait Gallery. Has anyone else been there? 2 people. Okay, if you're in Washington, D.C., the museums are all free. Go to them, and I recommend every single one of them. They're all fantastic. They're gorgeous. Anyway, so I went to the National Portrait Gallery, and I thought I'd do something, you know, this is my condescending scientist point of view. I thought I'd do something light and easy, right? Pictures on a wall, pff, easy. But it really opened my eyes, okay? I was doing the usual superficial visitor thing. You know, when you go to the art museum, that's nice, next. That's nice. And you move through the rooms pretty quickly, and you wonder, why does anybody take any time to go through a museum? Because they don't like this. Because you just zip through it. You get pictures to look at. You're done. Okay, so I was zipping through these, and then I just happened to turn this corner, and right there in my face was this painting. Let's see if I can make this work. Okay, first of all, that's my answer. This painting. Now, this is not a famous painting. It's not the most famous painting in the world. It's not considered the greatest painting in the National Portrait Gallery. It just happened that in my superficial touristy way, as I was zipping along, I happened to run into it and take a moment to look at it. There was just something about it that compelled my attention. And the thing is, it was beautiful. Look at the subject, it's enchanting. All right, there's these 2 women looking out. There's that smile on the face of the one and the coy laughter of the other. This is a big painting. This is like 6 feet tall. It's life size. So you turn this corner and there are these 2 very inviting women looking at you. No wonder I stopped and just stared for a little while. Anyway, so I'm staring at this thing. You know, it's gorgeous. The lighting is lovely. This does it no justice at all. Seriously, that's what I'm telling you. Go to the National Portrait Gallery. A digital reproduction of a painting is just shallow, superficial, doesn't show you any of the wonderful detail there. Okay, so anyway, the being there and seeing it, it's this gloriously cheerful, enticing painting. And I stood right there and I looked at it for 45 minutes. It was weird. I just got into this painting and stood there staring at it. You know, the usual thing that you imagine artists doing, where you peer up real close and you look closely at this section, and then you stand well back, and then you try different angles. That was me, and that was very unusual for me. Okay, so anyway, I'm looking at this thing. I'm no fancy art aficionado, but for a little while, I could really see what drew people into art. Now, this painting, if you want to look it up, it's by Bartolomé Esteban Murillo, and he's a 17th century Spanish artist. It's a portrait of 2 Galician women. So it's got 2 titles out there. Sometimes you'll hear it, 2 Galician women. Sometimes it's called 2 Women at a Window, but it's pretty easy to find it. But now I want to do a fictional part of this story. Imagine we're standing there looking at this painting, and I'm joined by a fellow art lover, somebody who thinks exactly as I do, that this is a gorgeous painting, and is enjoying looking at it. But he has a different idea. He says, this painting is so beautiful, it could not possibly have been created by Bartolomé Esteban Murillo. It could only have come into existence by supernatural means. And he says he knows exactly who painted it and what magic was involved, and he'd like to debate me on the subject. Do I need to paint the similarity to tonight's event with a broader brush? You get it? It's exactly the same sort of situation. Anyway, I'm looking at this. I see the placard. It says all these things about it. The correct answer is obvious to me, and I'm curious to see how this person is going to defend this peculiar position. Now, as a minimal necessity, what I expect to hear is, first of all, something about the identity of the mysterious true painter who actually created this painting. Something about the true painter's methods. Because I'm sitting there looking at this, I see brush strokes. I'm saying, oh, this was painted by somebody with a brush and oil paints and pigments and all this cool stuff, and quite a bit of skill. If you're going to say that this is created by supernatural means, you better tell me what those supernatural means were. And I, in particular, want to hear about epistemology. How does my opponent make his case? Where and how did he learn this mysterious truth about this painting? Now, in this little parable, I am disappointed, as I expect to be tonight. While insisting that everything had a supernatural cause, he instead dwells on the physicality of the painting. It's on canvas. The colors come from complex combinations of organic and inorganic compounds. Scientists can bounce lasers off it and determine the proportions of each element in it spectroscopically. It can be analyzed all over the place, digitized, taken apart, figured out in detail, and at every level, it's wonderfully complex. And what I would say then is, wait a minute, you're making my case for me. The painting is a natural object made of earthly matter, of compounds arranged in a way that is perfectly compatible with all physical laws. And we've heard a bit of that already tonight. So then he tells me, wait, look, it's made of hundreds of thousands of precise tiny brushstrokes, each one contributing to a whole. It's incredibly complex. It can't have been created by natural means. There must be some supernatural mind behind it. And I try to explain that complex objects are generated by natural mechanisms all the time, that something is complex is not evidence that it was spontaneously generated by an invisible spirit. We can look at how paintings are made even now and see equally complex images created without the aid of metaphysical agents. Now his reply is familiar. I get this all the time. His reply is to cast doubt on the existence of Bartolomé Esteban Murillo. Now, we don't know his exact birthday. All we know is it was sometime late in 1617. We also don't know his birthplace. Guesses are it was in Seville or another small town called Pilas. Therefore, we should question whether Bartolomé Esteban Murillo even really existed, or we should consider the possibility that he spontaneously erupted into existence sometime in 1617 by unnatural means. Okay, this is an argument that opens the door to the idea that some other mystical agent created the paintings using this other mystical agent, Murillo, as an agent to do it. Now, here's the problem I have. I will then be tempted to reply in kind. But we have a baptismal certificate for Murillo from 1618. We know the names of his parents. They were Gaspar and Maria, if you need to know. We know that he studied under Juan del Castillo. We know that he was prolific, that he did many paintings, that many of them have survived to the modern day, that they have a consistency of theme and style. We've got a pretty good picture of the activities of Bartolomé Esteban Murillo, even if we don't have every last autobiographical detail of his history, even if there are gaps in that history. Furthermore, we have expectations that how he was created was not by magic. I bet you Gaspar and Maria did something that's very familiar to all of us and is very biological. That the default assumption ought to be that there was a mundane mechanism, not a miracle. Okay, so that's the temptation that I respond by deluging you in kind with more and more details, while failing to address the great big void in the room. That despite postulating a supernatural mechanism, despite calling into doubt the existence of the material cause on the flimsiest of excuses, my critic has not revealed who the true painter is, how he knows his identity, how this creator placed all of those exquisite brush strokes on the canvas, and in fact, no positive evidence for his hypothesis is presented at all. That all we've got is vague hand-waving, trying to cast doubt on a productive, useful, and so far extremely successful hypothesis to explain where this painting came from, or to bring it into the context of what we're talking about now, where life came from. And my little story expresses my frustration with these kinds of events and tells you what I predict. I predict that tonight Dr. Rana will first simply assume without evidence that his proposed creator of all exists, and further that this creator is the Christian God. He will not actually defend this proposition because, first of all, to all of us atheists, we know it is indefensible. There is no logical, rational reason to believe that. And also because, as is typical at these events, many of you here in the audience take that principle for granted. How many of you believe that Jesus is your Lord and Savior? Quite a few of you. You're not going to call into question this whole idea that there was a creator who carried out this magical act. Whereas there's atheists here. How many atheists are here? I'm just curious now. Oh, we got a pretty good turnout. You know, if this were presented in front of an audience of atheists, that's the first thing they would be grilling Dr. Rana in is, okay, how do you know that this creator even exists? You're giving us all this stuff about how cells are complex and everything. We've given you a natural explanation for this. How come you can say, well, there was this magic guy named Jesus who poofed it all into existence? Okay, and that's a shame too, because the basis of the whole creationist premise relies entirely on the existence of this being. A being who leaves no trace of its activity and no explanation of its motives or methods. And furthermore, that when creationists explain what he has done, they're extremely vague about it. I'd like to hear something specific about exactly when this creator intervened in the history of life and exactly what he did and how it's known. I would suggest in the absence of any evidence for the proposed first cause, any discussion of its hypothetical actions is simply dismissible. Second, any attempt to justify the existence of this creator will involve pointing at a Bible, which commendably he's refrained from doing. I'm quite pleased that you've exercised that restraint. Or pointing at biology, chemistry, and physics. The Bible is irrelevant. I could point at the Harry Potter books, and at best they are evidence for the existence of J.K. Rowling, but not for the existence of magic powers. And I think even the Christians here in the audience will agree that Harry Potter is not evidence for the existence of magic wands that work. As for science, as I've seen many times before, and asked for evidence of supernatural miracles in the history of life, creationists provide examples of natural material processes rather than the actual supernatural processes we're asking for. It makes no sense. If you're insisting that a painting was created by magic, telling me about the fine details of the brushstrokes is making my case for me. You're explaining these natural processes that go on, no matter how complex they are. Okay, third, much of the argument will consist of claiming that the evolutionary explanation is incomplete or even erroneous in parts. We don't have the full picture of every step in abiogenesis. Dr. Rana is exactly right in that. We don't have a year-by-year breakdown of every chemical reaction that occurred that led to the emergence of life. That's something I agree entirely with. Science is always a work in progress, and if we knew everything, science would stop. But while nitpicking at the details and telling you about what we don't know, Dr. Rana will not say the obvious, that the creationist explanation is empty and non-existent, void of all details. It's fine to say, well, we don't know how you get from step A to step B. Then tell me what your powerful explanation for this is. And it's cheating to simply say a magic man done it. So these explanations all have so little explanatory power and are so feeble that this is why I can say I've already won. Science has already abandoned these arguments. We found them unproductive, not useful at all. They don't lead to new answers. You could say, well, they do a service by pointing out where there are gaps in our understanding, but we already knew about those gaps. We're actively trying to do research to fill those in. Okay. And I'm a little under time. Shall I just turn it over at this point? 5 minutes? You want me to go on? I couldn't go on for... I'm a college professor. I don't go on for 5 minutes. I go on for 5 hours. But okay. So let me at least make a stab at addressing one thing here. That is this argument from design. You know, it's a curious thing that Dr. Rana has said that we've revitalized the Watchmaker argument with new discoveries in biochemistry, because the Watchmaker argument was dead as a doornail almost over 200 years now. It was really thoroughly squashed right from the very beginning. So William Paley came out with his book in 1803, 1804, somewhere around there. It impressed a few people, including Charles Darwin, who quite liked the book. But what quickly happened is that people realized that there's a logical problem in this book, that there's a huge gap in this creationist story. And one of the people who did the most effective refutation of this, surprisingly, is a poet. You've probably heard of him, Percy Shelley. Percy Shelley wrote an excellent essay called A Refutation of Deism, which I recommend to all my atheist friends. If you haven't read it yet, read it now. In 1814, a poet sat down and blew apart William Paley's argument. No problem. Really easy. As you see in this, what he's saying is that there's a real problem with this whole argument. He's saying a designer must be proved before a designer can be inferred. That's what I said earlier, is that if you're going to tell me that a designer did it, show me evidence that there's a designer that exists. Don't simply point at something that you say looks designed and say, therefore, a designer. The matter in controversy is the existence of design in the universe, and so you don't get to do a shortcut. It's called begging the question, to assume the contested premises and thence infer the matter in dispute. Insidiously to employ the words contrivance, design, and adaptation before those circumstances are made apparent in the universe, thence justly inferring a contriver, is a popular sophism against which it behooves us to be watchful. It's an appealing idea. Oh, it looks designed, therefore there was a designer. But that's the whole point under question. For instance, there's a common syllogism that we heard from Dr. Rana, and I'll just tell you my version of it here. It's the syllogism that says, first of all, biological systems contain information. I will agree. Biological systems contains all kinds of interesting information. Step 2, information only comes from minds. Whoa, wait a minute. Where'd that come from? Where's your evidence that that happens? I'm looking at biological systems. We have a natural explanation for their origin that doesn't involve minds, and they've got information in them. Isn't that therefore wrong? You have to demonstrate to me that information only comes from minds. You can't simply assert it. And then they come to this conclusion that therefore biological systems come from minds. This is a logical fallacy from step 2 on. If you're going to make this assertion that information only comes from minds, you have to back it up with more than anecdotes. Sure, it's fine to say that our minds come up with design all the time. We design things. That does not imply that the only way that things that look designed can appear is from the action of a mind. And that's the challenging step that I haven't heard any creationist ever address. Maybe Dr. Rana will do it for us tonight. I'll be dazzled. We'll see. I'll probably argue with it, but we'll see. And with that, I will turn it over.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. With that, we're in our 2020 segment, so in 20 minutes, you can respond. Thank you.
Oh, I don't need my computer. I'll just. Yeah, I really very much appreciate your comments, Dr. Myers. I think you've raised, I think, some very important points that I hopefully will be able to address, maybe even adequately for you. The first issue is just even on the whole idea of doing a debate like this. And I would agree with you. I have no training in doing debates. I like doing debates. I don't really like debates. I'd rather do dialogues. I think that's informative. And I think there's real value in doing something like this because it helps people understand what the issues are. It helps people understand different perspectives. And I don't think that we're necessarily engaging in a discussion about a fringe idea. The notion of whether or not God exists, to me, is actually a big question. It's not a fringe idea. And I appreciate very much your thoughts about how science resolves controversies. And I'm a scientist, and I agree. Scientists are all about going into the lab and doing experiments, making observations in light of the theoretical framework to resolve controversies. But I would actually argue that tonight we're not really engaged in a discussion about science. It's really a philosophical or maybe even a theological discussion where we're looking to see what we know from science can aid or help in informing the conversation about God's existence. And so, I would argue that maybe we are engaged in a debate, and it is a theological or a philosophical debate. So I'm not sure I would disagree with you, but I think there's, again, value in doing this. Now, you raised some good questions here about the identity of the designer, the creator's methods, and things like that, and the nature of the Watchmaker argument. And so I'd like to address some of those. In terms of how do we know the characteristics of the designer, I would refer the discussion to archaeology, and specifically archaeology in the context of the question of human origins. Because anthropologists who study the fossil record and the archaeological record associated with hominins are pretty good at identifying pieces of rock that have been deliberately shaped by a hominin into some kind of tool. And they can actually tell from the way in which that tool was put together something about the biology and the behavior of that particular organism. And so you can start with the physical realm, and you can identify things in the realm that look like they were designed, and you can tell something about the nature of who that designer is. And in a sense, what William Paley was doing was that very activity. He was part of a school of scholars that were natural theologians who were trying to, from nature alone, discover what they could about who God was. They rejected the idea of going to the Bible and using that as revelation as the basis for understanding God's existence and who that creator was. They were going to nature itself. And so, for example, we could go to something like cosmology, and we could say, it looks like our universe has a beginning. And maybe our universe is part of a multiverse, maybe it's not. But even if it is part of a multiverse, every multiverse model that is a reasonable model requires a beginning. So we know that either the multiverse or our local universe requires a beginning, which means whatever caused the universe must be an entity that is transcendent, that exists outside the universe and has the power to bring the universe into existence. Now, it could be a personal being, it could be an impersonal force. I've heard Paul Davies basically argue that the multiverse idea is functionally equivalent to appealing to a creator or to a God in terms of bringing the universe into existence. There's really no way through observation to confirm the multiverse one way or the other. You might be able to develop theoretical models that suggest the multiverse exists, but in science, theories guide and experiments and observations decide. And short of being able to make those observations, it's an idea that is, in my mind, speculative, though not necessarily unreasonable. So the point I'm making here is that we can at least infer that whatever brought the universe into existence is a transcendent cause. And so if we argue that that cause is a personality, it begins to give us some sense or understanding of who that designer is. We know that the fundamental constants of the universe have to be exquisitely fine-tuned for life to be possible. Again, there may be explanations for that fine-tuning that are independent of any form of theism, but theists like to co-opt that idea as being consistent with the notion that the universe was brought into existence by a personality. And so you could argue that we have at least been able to point to the possibility that this creator is a transcendent creator that has personal characteristics. We talk about the fact that there's this analogy between the way in which biochemical systems are structured and the way human designs are structured. That suggests that there is a resonance between our mind and the mind of this personality. And so once we do that, now we can ask ourselves, are there any religious or philosophical systems that claim to have revealed truth that tell us something about who that or what that designer or creator is? And as we compare then those revealed truths to what we can discern from nature, we can conclude with some measure of reason, of certainty or confidence that it matches with the God of the Bible. And the idea that we're made in God's image as human beings explains the resonance that we see between human designs and biochemical designs. So that would be my stab at trying to identify the designer and do it in a way that is not relying exclusively on revelation alone. Now, when it comes to the means by which the creator functions, there's a rich discussion that happens within at least Christian theology that I'm familiar with, wrestling with the issue of divine action. And most people would argue that God would act in a variety of different ways, that he's not confined to act in a way that is outside the laws of nature, but could operate within the laws of nature as well. And in fact, my personal thought is that when it comes to the origin of life, that the way in which the Creator brought about the origin of life is through a mechanism that has been dubbed hypernaturalism. And this is work done by a theologian that we collaborate with at Reasons to Believe named Dan Dyke, and a friend of his who is a PhD physicist. And they've coined this idea of hypernaturalism, where they argue that God could operate within creation, and what constitutes a miracle would be a just right event happening at a just right time with the just right magnitude in order to affect something within the creation. And the argument would be that God is not going to operate in such a way that he suspends the laws of nature, because he's responsible for the creation, and therefore he's going to work with his creation, not work at odds with his creation. And I've actually written an article on our website called Hypernaturalism and the Origin of Life, where I speculate that, again, as human beings being made in God's image, we can go in the laboratory and we can get chemicals to do more or less what we want them to do with some measure of luck. I took organic chemistry, and I know what kind of a nightmare it is to get chemical reactions to work. But in effect, you could argue that organic chemists are functioning hypernaturally. We're working within the laws of nature to carry out processes that are not non-natural, but are, again, happening because we are controlling the conditions so that the just right thing happens at the just right time with the just right magnitude. And so could you extend that to the origin of life, where you would argue that maybe God is functioning hypernaturally, that God is, if you will, a chemist or a divine chemist or a divine chemical engineer. But the larger point I'm making here is that there doesn't have to be this dichotomy between the supernatural and the natural, because as a Christian, I believe that the creation is God's creation, and that he can work within his creation to accomplish things just as well as working outside of his creation. And so though I'm a skeptic of aspects of the evolutionary paradigm, I would argue that whether evolution is true or not has really no bearing on the question of God's existence, or even because one could basically argue that God is creating through an evolutionary process. So anyway, one other, okay, I think those are the 2 points that you made or you raised. Now, what about the whole watchmaker argument? I have spent quite a bit of time thinking through the watchmaker argument because I would agree with your assessment. It's an argument that was soundly criticized when Paley advanced it. In fact, David Hume even offered a critique of the watchmaker reasoning prior to Paley writing his book, Natural Theology. And when you look at the nature of Hume's criticism, it's really a criticism leveled against analogical reasoning, in that when you're doing comparisons in analogical reasoning, the more similar the things you're comparing, the more certain the conclusion you can draw. And the less similar, the less certain the conclusion you draw. And the idea here is that it's inductive reasoning. Your conclusions are always probabilistic. Oh, was this not on? Okay, so the conclusions are probabilistic. But the idea here is that if you're going to reason in a sound way using analogical reasoning, then you need to do as many possible comparisons as you can. You need to make sure you're comparing as many attributes as possible. Those attributes must be relevant to the conclusion that you're drawing. You need to take into account the way the systems are dissimilar. And if you do that, you can reach sound conclusions through analogical reasoning. That's the most common way to reason. On a day in and day out basis, we're reasoning effectively using analogies. Analogies are part of science. It's part of legal reasoning. Your presentation was essentially an analogical argument. And so I think the core method of reasoning that undergirds the watchmaker argument is a sound way to reason. And we have to take into account Hume's criticism. And I discuss this in detail in the book, The Cell's Design. And so to me, that's why it's important that we recognize that there's a number of attributes that define the cell's chemistry that, again, are analogous to what we do as human designers, and that for each of those attributes, we can identify a multitude of systems that display those properties. And so it's really a weight of evidence comparison. I focused only on a single feature, but when you do it across the board, you've got a weight of evidence where you're arguing that there's a body of pointers that suggest, again, this strong similarity. And so therefore, in terms of Hume's concern, it's a sound way to reason. And then, of course, I brought up the other argument against the watchmaker line of reasoning, and that's the notion that natural processes can do it. And, you know, I laid out a case for why I thought work in chemical evolution is essentially not producing any kind of compelling reason to think that the origin of life could happen through evolutionary means without any kind of divine or intelligent agency intervening in the process. And, you know, I would argue that it's not the fact that I would argue that I'm not making a God of the gaps argument, that I'm rather looking at what's been done in prebiotic chemistry, and time again, any success that's realized is due to the contribution of the researcher himself or herself, who is rigging the system to make things successful, and you won't have that resource available on the early Earth. And so I'm actually arguing from a 60-year history of work in prebiotic chemistry that time and time again, the one thing that's constant is the role that the researcher is playing. And so it is an empirical argument for, again, the role of intelligent agency in bringing God into existence. Now, in terms of the syllogism that you suggested that I was employing, where you basically said biochemical systems are information systems, and then you said that my assertion was that information only comes from a mind, and actually my assertion is not that, but rather my assertion would be our common experience is that when we encounter information, we recognize that it comes from a mind. It very well is possible, and this is really the question on the table, that information could come from some kind of natural process mechanism. And this is a statement that I'm going to make that's not going to make my intelligent design friends very happy, but I actually am of the opinion that evolutionary processes can generate information. There's a wealth of work in vitro evolution that shows that very point. But I would actually go back to an argument that I made in my presentation, that when you look at the work that's happening in vitro evolution, those conditions, again, in the laboratory are highly artificial conditions. And so what it's showing is that in principle, evolutionary mechanisms can generate information, but the question is there any kind of way those processes or some analogous process like that would happen on the early Earth, and nobody's been able to show that in any kind of compelling way. And so I would argue that the information that is created through evolutionary means in the laboratory through in vitro evolution is, again, because the researchers have rigged the system in such a way that it allows the evolutionary process to be efficient enough to generate that information. Now, Paul Davies actually points out that the information that you generate through in vitro evolution is what he calls simple information. It's essentially syntactical information that has meaning attached to it in a molecular context. And he argues that in reality, biochemical systems are algorithmic information harboring systems where the matter itself is possessing instructions that tell the matter how to behave, which is really incredibly provocative. And he argues that we have no mechanism or understanding of how algorithmic information like that could arise. And so while I do think in vitro evolution shows evolutionary mechanisms can generate that information, I don't know that we've got any mechanism that we understand currently for generating algorithmic information. So my point would be that as part of my syllogism, the question would be, or the syllogism would be, biochemical systems or information systems or common experience is that information comes from a mind. When we try to look at how evolutionary processes would generate information that you would need it for life, again, we can see in principle how that would work, but in practice we don't know how that would happen on the early Earth. Therefore, it's reasonable to conclude that the information that we see in the cell is from the work of a divine mind. So that's how I would frame the syllogism.
Okay, so you're not going to be surprised at this. I'm still unsatisfied, but we'll work that out. So for example, he talked about how do we know that something is designed, and he gave the excellent example of archaeology, that it's routine for archaeologists and anthropologists to be examining artifacts that to the casual eye might look like just some random piece of junk, and discern that it was actually shaped by human hands. Now the thing is, how do they do that? Well, they're actually comparing it to artifacts created by human hands. They have something to match it against. For instance, the Leakeys discovered all these nice little rocks that were sharpened on one edge, and the way they figured out that those were created by human hands is they asked, okay, what kind of processes shape rocks? You could imagine being knocked around in a stream bed by bouncing off of one another. They worked out all these different mechanisms that put edges on rocks, and they compared them with what they found. And the only explanation was by comparing it appropriately to how people shaped rocks. So that's what you need, is you need something, a template to compare it with. Intelligent design creationists tacitly acknowledge that what they talk about is something called specified information. And specified information is simply information that has some other analog that you can compare it to, and you can say, oh, this is a copy of this information over here. Of course, they never get around to saying how they know that we have specified information. It's because they haven't got anything to compare it with. But this is what we need, is some kind of external information. So, for instance, if we were digging around, if the archaeologists were digging around, they found some ancient spaceship buried in Africa, and in there were some metal plates with the genetic code for a human being, put on them, then I would say, oh yeah, we can compare that, and oh man, they're the same. I guess we're going to have to give it up and say, yeah, there was some kind of intelligent intervention. But absent that, you can't say that. He also made the argument from the first cause that there had to be some kind of transcendent being to create the universe. And then there were a few logical leaps in there. For instance, I would say, okay, we look at an avalanche, and avalanches aren't necessarily caused by malicious activity by an intelligent being. Now, are they? They can just be caused by, fracture caused by changes in temperature. That can trigger an avalanche. Yet somehow we're supposed to assume that the cause is a personality, that it's some godlike being, and I don't see the reasoning behind that. Why should we assume that? Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was just some force, as Davies talks about. There was an argument made just like this thousands of years ago for the case of lightning, right? What causes lightning? Well, something must cause lightning. I think it's Thor. Again, it's arguing from ignorance. Yeah, we as human beings are used to intelligent activity triggering things, and we impose that idea on our ideas about the first cause of some particular activity. And it's a bias we should watch against. I don't think it's a valid argument. Similarly, there was an argument made that biological systems and constructed systems seem to have some parallels. That when we look at the things that people build, and then we look at biology, we say, that's just like that, it's awful similar, so we assume that whatever created the biology was thinking in the same way we do. There's a couple problems with that. One is, in the first part of his talk, Dr. Rana noted that at the time of William Paley, they postulated that life was like the most complicated artifact they could imagine, a watch. Do we still think that life works like a watch? No, it's pretty clear it doesn't. So nowadays, here in the 21st century, we've got people arguing, well, life is just like a computer program or a computer system, because that happens to be the most complicated artifact we have at our disposal. Is that valid? Will people in the 22nd century say, oh, no, that's ridiculous. Life is just like a quantum computer. No, they won't do that. Well, some people will. There will always be this argument made. But it's a fallacious argument. What it is we taking our experience and imposing our interpretation of that experience on natural systems. It's like a watch, because that's what we know. It's like a computer, because that's what we know. But I don't think it's true. I have an extensive background in computer programming, computer design, and computer engineering. I actually spent a number of years doing this. And I also have an extensive background in molecular biology and genomic structure and things like that. And I can tell you right now, no, they're not anything alike. They are completely different. If you would try to shoehorn biological design into the model of a computer, you're going to blow it. It's not going to work. The biological programs are not like computer programs at all. The information in the genome is not organized in any sensible way. I guarantee any of you who are programmers, are there any programmers here? There you go. Try designing something like the human genome. You'll get fired if you try to get that through your boss. It simply doesn't work. They're completely different. Then, of course, we've got this other argument. Well, as I said, typically what we do is we try to come up with a template to explain how something works. So when, for instance, those hand axes, we look at those, we say they're like the things that people make. Therefore, it's reasonable to assume that they are made by people. But when it comes down to biology, we're reduced to this very strange statement that we're designed in God's image. And I'm sure all the atheists here, their eyes lit up at this, because we're all wondering, okay, what does God look like? Do you have a picture of him? Do you have God's genetic code? Do you have a map of his physiology? What bones does God have? Are there 206 just like in human beings? Say what? Okay, that's good enough. That's good enough. So you're saying that we're designed after a triune spirit? Yeah. Okay. Well,
I see we're itching to get into our next segment here.
we'll stop.
I appreciate it. That's fine.
That makes my point.
We'll have a time for the back and forth. Thank you.
Yes, but that makes my point for me is that we make this argument that humans are designed in God's image, but when we try to pin down a believer on what God's image is, we get these vague nebulosities. It's a spirit form. It's a trinity. I've read the book. We've got all this stuff. It does not look, this God does not look anything like me, okay? It doesn't look anything like you. So you cannot use that argument to say, people were created in God's image, therefore that's evidence that God created us. That's another syllogism that simply falls apart at the first prod. It simply doesn't work. Hume's criticism of analogical reasoning, yeah, that's a good one, that he does make some solid criticisms, that there were many criticisms made of Paley's argument. So I don't see why we can say it's revitalized now. It was shot down by Hume. It was shot down by Shelley. Those of you who've read Natural Theology and Darwin's Origin of the Species, I actually have had some of my students do this as an exercise. It's amazing. Darwin actually wrote The Origin of Species as a reply to natural theology. You can see these parallels throughout it, that what he does is he brings up issues that Paley brings up and he says, okay, here's this argument, here's why it's wrong. Over and over and over again. Paley's argument about the eye, for instance, is soundly refuted by Darwin's argument in The Origin of the Species. So this is a dead cause. Paley's been so, the ghost of Paley ought to just retire and move somewhere convenient like Florida where it's warm or something, but stop haunting all of science. It has simply been rejected and doesn't work either analogically or logically or in any relationship with what we know about biology. Now, Dr. Rana did make a very good valid point that a lot of the chemistry of early life, the chemistry studying protobiology, is jaundiced. It is biased in a particular way to produce results that we can interpret. And that's simply a consequence of the nature of science. That if you're going to do an experiment, you don't just say, I'm going to create life in a test tube today. I'm just going to throw everything in there and presto, life will emerge, because nobody will believe you, even if it works. Scientists won't believe you. They'll just say that was a sloppy experiment. What scientists expect is controlled, simple experiments that show individual steps of the process. So what's going on in the biology of early life right now, in chemical evolution, is step-by-step, careful dissections of pieces of the story that we hope to assemble into a whole at some point. You can't simply dismiss it. What we do know, for instance, is that, simple experiments where you put certain primitive compounds under high pressure and temperature, and you get pyruvate out. As Dr. Rana knows, pyruvate's right there at the heart of metabolism. It's a really important molecule to have spontaneously synthesized under these conditions. So we can say safely, okay, there's bits and pieces of this story that we can replicate in the lab, but you're perfectly right. We haven't put together the whole story. We can't until we've got all the pieces there. We're in the stage of the puzzle that you've just popped out of the box and you've just gone around and you've flipped over the pieces so they're right side up, and maybe you sorted out a few of the blue pieces over here. There's the sky, and here's a few green pieces, these are the trees, and that's where we're at. We got 1,000 puzzle pieces sitting there that we're only slowly putting together. And what we'll do is stepwise take them and see how they fit. So that's what's going to happen. Give them time. I'll also point out that a lot of the chemical evolution research has been revolutionized in just the last 10, 15 years. Dr. Rana mentioned the RNA World hypothesis and how we argue about building these macromolecules. A lot of the new stuff is focusing on an earlier step. If you Google metabolism first, that's the magic phrase, you'll find that there's a whole body of research that is just skipping the whole RNA, DNA step. That's a later step, and going right back to the beginning and using principles of thermodynamics to figure out, okay, what kind of chemical events could be shackled in the history of early life to lead to the synthesis of more complex macromolecules. Start simple, build up from there. So that's where they're going. Okay, and lastly, I'll just mention, yes, my syllogism, in which I said, okay, I paraphrased him as saying information only comes from minds. Rewording it doesn't help. Saying that our common experience is that information comes from a mind does not help. Our common experience, the stuff that we as human beings experience in our day-to-day life, are a really poor guide to how biochemistry works. As you must know, having worked in biochemistry, a lot of things in biochemistry are counterintuitive. That it takes a new way of thinking in order to work out how reactions occur in biochemical systems. That there's a lot of material there that isn't based on common experience. It's built on mathematics, it's built on experimental chemistry. And that's the case here. It's fine to say that our common experience is that minds generate information. I would agree. When I sat down and typed up this talk, that was my human mind generating information on this complex device built by other human beings. So I will agree that, yeah, that happens. But it doesn't address the question, which is, can that information arise by natural mechanisms without a mind behind it? And as you've already admitted, yes, there are genetic processes that do generate new information. So then why do we need God? I'm missing that part. Okay, well, I'll turn it over.
We're into our 10-10 segment here, and so we're going to let our speakers just ask questions of one another in these few moments. So, Dr. Rana, if you'd like to begin.
Okay, well, I just have one question, and it has to do with the idea of our minds being the product of an evolutionary history. And the question is, and I'll unpack it just a smidgen, is if our minds are indeed the product of evolutionary history, how can we be certain that anything we observe about the universe or reason about the universe is actually true? Because the notion would be, at least my understanding would be, that evolution is essentially producing minds that promote our survivability, not necessarily promote the discovery or the recognition of truth. And in fact, it's even conceivable that we could actually identify false positives if those false positives actually promote survivability. And there's an interesting passage from a letter Charles Darwin wrote to William Gray, where he says, "With me the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which have been developed from the mind of lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions in such a mind?" So how would you address the origin of our truth identifying capacity from an evolutionary perspective?
Okay, I actually agree with that. And one of my other hats that I wear is as a neuroscientist. And one of the things that's absolutely true is that our minds are unreliable. Memory is unreliable. We often make logical fallacies. These are not, strictly speaking, truth-generating computational machines. They are survival-generating machines. What I think, though, is that that explains religion quite a bit. That religion is an illogical product of our minds. Because we thought of it doesn't make it true. But then you might ask, okay, how do we know anything is true? And that's why we have science. That's the whole purpose of science, is to get beyond the limitations of our mind and have a disciplined, coherent mechanism for collecting data, transmitting it to other people, interpreting it. That what we do is always provisional, that we can change everything just by a new discovery. And that means it's not a change in the universe, it's a change in how our minds perceive it. This has been the case for centuries. My favorite example in developmental biology is I love to talk about Hans Driesch, who did this cool experiment separating out the blastomeres of a sea urchin. He takes a newly developed sea urchin embryo and he tears it apart into fourths and puts them in separate dishes and asks what will happen, and he's kind of expecting, oh, it'll grow a left side over here and a right side in that dish and back half over here. What he found is that they regenerated and they produced the entire embryo. And what he postulated at that time was that there was a divine intelligence that was regulating them. That was the model he was working with. He was theologically inclined. He said, oh, wow, this is proof that there's guiding spirits who shape life on Earth. And of course, later developmental biologists figured out, no, it's not. It's cell-cell communication. There's all these interactions that are going on, and we can map them out and figure them out very precisely. And that represented a major shift in how we thought about embryology. That could happen again, It could be that there will be some discovery that comes along that says we were all wrong. There was shape-shifting octopoid aliens from Betelgeuse who came down here and created life. We're open to that. Show us the evidence. Similarly, we could say, okay, there are space ghosts from another dimension that do this, that we mistake for God. Maybe we'll find that Jesus actually did it. But you won't get there by saying, oh, let's poke holes in the existing theories. You'll get there by showing us actual evidence for that phenomenon.
Do you have a reply, Dr. Rana?
Yeah, and I thought that was an excellent response. And the question, I think, still becomes, if religion is essentially, in an evolutionary framework, the queen mother of false positives, right? That still, I think, raises a lot of concern about even the application of the scientific method. Because again, part of the scientific method is observing patterns and then trying to interpret those patterns. And it seems like you ultimately may very well be undermining the very enterprise of science itself, to me, by looking at the human mind as a survival machine.
Well, but it explains things so well. Because, like you say, we use our minds to interpret patterns. And I look at the patterns around the world, and what I see is that in one part of the world, they believe in Islam, and in another part, they believe in Buddhism, and in another part, they believe in Christianity. They can't all be true, right? Unless you're a deist, then we're going to have to completely throw everything out. But they can't all be true, so there's got to be something invalid about that. And I refuse to say that, oh, all the people who believe in Islam are wrong, and all the people that believe in Christianity are right, or vice versa. What I see is the case is that no, none of them are right, that they believe in these specific beliefs about God for different reasons than their truth value. That those of you who are in a church here, you all know this, you found community there, right? You got friends. You get together, you help each other. And I'm looking at that and I'm saying, oh, wow, that's Darwinian survival value right there. That's where it comes from. Not because you're right about Jesus, but because you're right about a good way to work with your fellow human beings. Similarly with science, what science is all about is we recognize the unreliability of these ideas for generating truth statements. So we've formulated a very specific procedure that lets us go through and analyze. And yeah, it's led to science. As we all know, science hasn't necessarily led to better survival. We'll know in the next century or two, won't we?
Dr. Meyer, do you have a question for Dr. Rana?
Well, you know, I kind of asked them at the beginning that what I would like to see someday from a creationist is evidence of a miracle. That what we're doing here is, I'm on the side of the mundane, and I'm saying everything's done by natural processes, it's all made of matter, there's nothing spiritual, magical about this. And you're in the position of saying, no, there had to have been a miracle at some point, that mundanity is not sufficient. Where's the evidence for the miracle? Now, and I don't mean just saying the mundane explanation is inadequate, because there will always be inadequacies. The question is, what is the positive evidence for a miraculous event in the history of life?
Okay, well, you know, I would argue the origin of life. It would be that particular example. You know, and again, I laid out my argument that from the patterns that we observe with regard to origin of life researchers doing prebiotic chemistry, we know that, again, intelligent agency is critical to get that chemistry to work. This is where synthetic biology, I think, is very provocative. You know, you know, when you look at the work that's done to generate artificial biochemical systems, or, you know, the work that's moving towards the generation of protocells, which I think is science at its very best, and some of the best minds in the world are doing this work. And it's phenomenal work. You know, as a biochemist, I just am in awe at what's being accomplished. But again, the pattern that you see time and time again is intelligent agency is required. And so, again, when it comes to the origin of life, it seems like that pattern is suggesting that there must be intelligent agency at that point. And that's where you lose me, because, you know, for instance, what I can do is I can look at a modern cell. And you know this, you've written about how complicated they are. There are all these things going on there. Nowhere in the operation of the cell, the modern cell, is a miracle required. That what's going on here is basic thermodynamics, basic biochemistry. There's physical and chemical processes at work in there, but there aren't any angels in the cell pushing things around, right? So why should I then assume that in a simpler form of life, it required angels, or whatever the miraculous analog is? That what we've got is a simpler and simpler problem going back. And when I look at the biochemistry, what I see is a lot of principles of thermodynamics, energy capture, synthesis, and degradation, all embodied in these organisms. That seems sufficient to me. I just don't see where the gap is that we need to fill in with something magical. The analogy I would use would be an automobile engine. An automobile engine, like the cell, is not violating the laws of nature. It operates in accordance to the laws of nature, yet its origin is not explained through the laws of nature, but through intelligent agents who have manipulated the laws of nature in a hypernatural way to produce that automobile. So likewise, I would argue the cell, again, is like an automobile engine. Its origin requires intelligent agency, but once it's in place, it's going to follow the laws of nature in an incredibly efficient, elegant manner.
Okay, but this again is the argument from analogy.
Yes.
That I would agree that, yeah, an automobile engine needs to be designed and built by people. But you haven't demonstrated that the cell needs to be designed by an intelligent agent. As I said, what I see is a set of processes that are natural and unguided in operation right now, that producing me from my parents' gametes did not require magic, although they probably thought so. Okay, that kind of magic. But anyway, real magic, it wasn't required to do that. So what we can do is we can push this back and back. You know, that I didn't need magic to create me, this was a natural process. That my great-grandparents, same thing. My distant ancestors, my non-human distant ancestors, my ancestral fish ancestors, going right back to the first cell. None of those required this intervention. And if we're going to talk about, well, we're more murky on the origin of cells, well, we're pushing it back to about 3.5 billion years ago when the first cell emerged. Are you then conceding that everything since then has required no intervention from a deity?
No, I would argue that there's places.
Okay, what are these places?
I would argue the Cambrian explosion to me seems a place where there's a requirement for divine intervention. It just, the chasm between multicellular animals that have tissue-grade organization and the emergence of these organisms that have integrated systems, to me, seems to be an incredible chasm that I do not see at this juncture an adequate evolutionary explanation. And again, I'm sure you would come back and say that's just God of the gaps reasoning.
Yeah.
But it does seem to me like that's a place where an intervention is required. And it's interesting. I just read through the book on the textbook on the Cambrian explosion by Doug Irwin and Jim Valentine, and I get the very distinct impression they feel like evolutionary theory at this point is lacking something critical to explain the genesis of body plans, and argue that once a body plan is in place, a body plan can't evolve into another body plan because of what they argue is internal selection. So that would be a place where, to me, it looks like you clearly need intervention. I would argue the origin of human consciousness is another place, or human uniqueness is a place where, again, there seems to be a divine intervention. So those would be places minimally I would point to.
Okay. Well, to address the Cambrian explosion, we have precursors. We've got fossils of the precursors, the Precambrian. It was not poof, all of a sudden there's these animals there. We actually have a pretty detailed map of what happened. Furthermore, we've got the molecular biology that what we can do is we can actually reconstruct the genetics of organisms that arose early on. And there doesn't seem to be any particular barrier between getting from a multicellular blob to a worm to a even more better organized creature like an arthropod or a vertebrate. So, I just don't see that one being a particular problem. It's an interesting phase in evolutionary history because things changed abruptly and crossed a wide number of phyla, but there was nothing radical there. And it's really interesting that you point out that Valentine and Irwin are arguing for some inadequacies in modern evolutionary theory, because that's actually what I'm going to Los Angeles to talk about, is that, yeah, it's true. Most of us have this idea, it's all natural selection that gets us there. But that's not the case, that there have been some major rethinks going on in the field of evolutionary biology, and we're now thinking about other mechanisms. However, Irwin and Valentine will also tell you that those are natural mechanisms, that what they are is processes that are described by population biology that are outside of the usual natural selection mechanisms, which is just fine. I mean, we've got all these other cool things going on. So that, and anyway, that's what I'm talking about in Los Angeles. You're all invited, come on down. Is all these new discoveries that are saying, here's a whole nother set of processes that open the door to an interesting explosion of possibilities.
Well, it's interesting because I'm under the impression from my reading of the literature, and I am by no means an expert in developmental biology or in paleontology, but I enjoy reading the literature. But it looks to me as if when you build the evolutionary trees, that you actually wind up with not a convergence into a single ancestral point, but rather like the Lophotrochozoans have have their own tree, and the Ichthyozoans their own tree, and the Deuterostomes their own tree. So you're almost as if you have, in effect, 3 Cambrian explosions when you look at the phylogenetics. And again, right. That seems to be, and even like the Ediacarans, or however you pronounce that, the fauna.
You pronounce it right. Okay, very good. Okay.
It doesn't seem like you have, and there may be a few instances where you do see that continuity, but in a lot of instances, it almost as if there doesn't seem to be that continuity between the Cambrian fauna and what you see prior to that.
Yeah, the ediacarans are an interesting case. This is a whole different group of organisms that are Precambrian. They tend to look like little quilted sheets and pillows, and they lived on the surface, the floor of the ocean. And they're probably a dead end. So it's really hard to relate them to the other phyla that we now have extant. But I would disagree that, Lophotrochozoans and that's things like snails and so forth are related to us. And that what we find over and over again is that as we analyze the genomes, and there's more and more genomic information coming out, we are seeing the commonalities. So, for example, you've heard of Hox genes? Maybe. Hox genes are these important genes that are involved in patterning the body plan and setting up this thing, the kinds of things that Erwin and Valentine were talking about. And you look at us and we have this longitudinal arrangement. Same as with flies, they have this, they have a head end, they have a tail end, and then you look at something like a sea urchin and you say, how the heck does that fit in that? And what we've been finding is that, yeah, they have those same genes. That, for instance, we have these genes in a nice order in our genome. When you look at a sea urchin, what you've discovered is they fragmented the genes, they've blown them all apart. They no longer have that linear structure, and it correlates with the absence of a linear bilaterian structure in the sea urchins. But yeah, what we find is they share these genes with us. One of my favorite examples is a gene that I just adore because it's important developmentally, and that's receptor tyrosine kinases, which for many years were thought to be the hallmarks of animals. Only animals have receptor tyrosine kinases, they said. And it's true, plants don't have them, fungi don't have them, only animals. Maybe that's where God intervened and he put RTKs in us. But then they were found in certain protozoa. And these protozoa are thought to be ancestral to modern animals. So once again, we've traced them back to a protist, and we see those similarities. So I would say, yeah, we can get things back down to a single point. That single point was probably about 1 billion years ago.
Thank you very much. We're going to open up to some questions, and myself being moderator, I get the first two. And so I'd like to ask Dr. Rana, how you would, speaking of syllogisms, how would you react to the first sentence here of Shelley? Design must be proved before a designer can be inferred. Seems like quite a reasonable. Mm-hmm. What would your reaction to that be? And elaborate a little bit.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I would agree with that. Mm-hmm. And, the question becomes, how exactly do you recognize design? And I think you have to engage in some kind of comparison. And so, in the cell's design, I basically argue that the only instance that we know of demonstrably know of for agents that affect design would be human beings. And so I argue that the template for design is what we would do as human beings. And that's, again, how I would look at nature and say, do we see a similar type of template in nature? And I would argue that we do see that in biochemical systems. And, it's interesting when you think about again, nanoscience and nanotechnology in the area of biomimetics, where we're now actually seeing the designs in nature inspiring human designs. So you now almost have this feedback in design, if you will.
Backward engineer the technology, yeah. Which leads me to, I have a parable for you, Dr. Meyer. Let's say that we are, similar to this first sentence here, we are archaeologists, and we happen upon an island that is totally deserted, supposedly, and we are digging around in a cave, and we discover on a slab these what appear to be in linear text of some kind, scratchings. We know from what we've been told nobody has ever inhabited this island. Would it be unreasonable to assume that at some point some mind put together that script, irrespective of the fact that we have no idea what these people look like? We have no way of really knowing what instrument they used, whether it be metal or rock or wood or whatever. We can't read the script necessarily, but we know what we're looking at and can rightfully infer a mind that composed that, whatever it is. Is that not a reasonable inference?
It is reasonable in the sense that what you're doing is comparing it to a known template, that you are familiar with how humans write, that people put out these linear arrays of symbols. So what you're doing is drawing a direct analogy and saying, okay, that's just like what people do. We don't have a natural process that spontaneously generates lines of symbols on a slab.
That's my point.
So we'll say, okay, that's a reasonable inference. Where I would say it falls down is when you look at a strand of DNA and you say, okay, there's a line of symbols there. And I would say, but we have a natural process that generates strands of DNA. So why do we need to invoke a designer for that?
What literature can you point to that would demonstrate that natural processes can develop computer code?
Oh, but I told you this earlier. It's not computer code. It looks nothing like computer code. It's mostly junk. It's gibberish with occasional bits of translated code that translates into a protein with some regulatory elements. It's a hodgepodge in there. What requires the DNA to operate is the synthetic machinery of the cell as well. So it's a synergistic system. But it's nothing like a computer program.
It's just interesting that we would backwards engineer certain features of that system to make our own technology, if it's hodgepodge. But anyway.
Which ones do we
Well, I'm thinking of the ENCODE project material that took the functional elements of the junk DNA supposedly and have discovered,
Do you really want me to rant about ENCODE?
If you'd like to, and I'd like to hear Dr. Rana respond.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
ENCODE is a disaster. ENCODE is a project where they were going to map out all the functional elements of the genome. So what they're doing is a bunch of biochemical assays. And one of the lead investigators came out with this remarkable announcement that 80% of the genome is functional, and that he thinks the other 20% will be functional as well. And every evolutionary biologist in the world did a major facepalm. That makes no sense at all. There's mathematical reasons it can't. Studies of genetic load show it doesn't. Studies of genomic structure show that no, those aren't functional. Large bodies of repetitive DNA. Basically what it was a very crude biochemical assay for function that was not appropriate. That any time a protein touched the DNA strand, it was marked as, oh, that's functional, which is not the case. The analogy I like to use is, imagine that all the lights go off in here and it's pitch dark, and I'm a protein who has to get out the door. What I will do is walk down and fumble and touch things, trying to find my way to the door handles, and then I'll exit. Does that mean that every single person and chair and object that I touch is functional? That's its purpose, is to help me get to the door? I think that's ridiculous. Anyway, there's a whole bunch of rigorous mathematical arguments that prove that ENCODE was invalid, that they were operating out of ignorance, and it's really kind of an embarrassing thing for science. I would agree with Dr. Rana that sometimes our preconceptions lead to fallacies and errors in science even.
Yeah, well, I've actually written like a 3-part series or a 4-part series on our website about the ENCODE result, and then responding to the criticisms of the ENCODE conclusions. And you know, we could probably spend a long time talking about this, but you know, I would actually I think you're making reference to the binding of transcription factors to the DNA, and you know, I would argue that they weren't just looking at every time it was touching it; they were actually looking at binding proper. And I would grant that there's going to be some binding that very well could be non-functional, but just intuitively as a biochemist, if you're going to have that much binding that takes place that is, you know, quote unquote non-functional, it's going to create such a mess that you would think natural selection would weed it out. Or, you know, a huge amount of the genome is being transcribed, you know, and to have that level of transcription, I don't know what the figure is off the top of my head, 60 or 70% being transcribed. To have that level of transcription, and most of it is noise, would create so much junk in the cell and would be so energy intensive, you would think that would be eliminated. Plus, we're understanding that a lot of those transcripts are actually taking part in gene regulatory networks, you know, as part of this competitive endogenous RNA hypothesis. And so I feel like the ENCODE results were by and large reasonable, and I thought the way they defined function was consistent with how we typically define function when we're doing biochemical assays. So I think the results actually are sound.
Okay, well, you know, we know that spurious transcription is a real phenomenon. It happens. The fact that...
And again, I wouldn't dispute that,
yeah.
But I would say to the degree that it's being claimed, it seems hard to imagine if it's not functional.
Well, we have a number of arguments that it is non-functional. For one, you know, we have the full genomic data. We've analyzed it out the wazoo. We know it's there. We know that there's long stretches of repetitive DNA. There's parasitic DNA like lines and signs. There's endogenous retroviruses. And those make up over half the genome. We know that's not functional, that's, you know, it's parasitic or redundant or garbage. So we know that that's not functional. So when you tell us that this much of it is functional, we're going to look at you askance. Furthermore, since the 1930s, we've worked out in great mathematical detail this concept of genetic load and exactly how many genes could be present in a cell for it to survive. You know, common errors, mutational errors during replication. And the answer has been very consistent. It's between 10,000 and 30,000 genes. You can't have more than that. If you do, the genetic load is so huge that nobody survives because everybody is born with lethal errors and they croak. And this has been rigorously demonstrated. So we know that there can't be more than about 30,000 selected genetic elements in the genome, which is about the number of genes that are present. So when we've mapped out the genes, we've looked at them and compared them to mathematics, that's the answer we get. It fits. And to then say that, no, there's 100,000 selected genetic elements or 200,000, we're just going to say, but then we'd all be dead.
Yeah. Well, you know, and I would actually argue that there's a mounting body of data that indicates that what we traditionally thought to be non-functional DNA is turning out to have function. And for example, when it comes to pseudogenes, both duplicated and unitary pseudogenes, something that's really interesting is this idea of a competitive endogenous RNA hypothesis, where the argument is RNA is serving a dual role. One is to messenger RNA, is serving a dual role. One is to, you know, be translated into proteins, and the other is to actually take part in a regulatory network where you have members of the members of the network are defined by microRNA recognition elements on the messenger RNAs. And so the duplicated pseudogenes and unitary pseudogenes are part of this network. And their similarity to, in the case of duplicated pseudogenes, to the quote-unquote parent gene is actually necessary in order for the microRNA recognition elements to bind and be you know, for that to function as a decoy to sop it up. So the point is that, you know, what we traditionally thought were non-functional elements, that you'd look at the ENCODE results and say, well, we know that these are non-functional. There's other studies that are actually indicating function. And it's almost as if pseudogenes, we're going from isolated examples of duplicated and unitary pseudogenes as being functional to what looks like universal functionality to me as I'm looking at where the literature is going.
You know, I agree that there have been functions found for some elements that have been traditionally recognized as junk DNA. That there is regulation going on that recognizes some of those elements. The thing is, it's been quantified, and it's less than a few % of the genome is actually involved in this kind of process. So it's like saying, okay, we've, you know, 90% of the genome is junk, but we found this 1% over here that isn't. Therefore, the rest of it isn't. And that's simply not the case. That doesn't work. That we know that most of it doesn't do anything. That we can find isolated instances of some that do doesn't refute the idea that most of it is junk.
And I guess my point is that using pseudogenes as an example, it's gone from an isolated instance here and there of what appears to be function to what I would argue any pseudogene that's transcribed is actually functional. And again, it's part of this endogenous, this competitive endogenous RNA hypothesis, where these are playing a role in regulatory networks, you know.
And I'll argue again, it's a tiny fraction of the genome.
Folks,
and
can
I suspect we're moving beyond.
Yeah,
the realm.
sorry.
break in here just
Yeah.
Has this been technical enough tonight for you guys? Okay. Now I'm going to turn it over to you and ask a few. You can ask a few questions. How many wrote down a question? You have a question? Okay, this man had his hand up first. Please give this man the mic right over here. Okay. I just want to make an observation before your question. You don't need a mic. I do want to make an observation that all the reasoning tonight has been analogical. Just, go ahead.
I grew up in Ames, Iowa. My dad was a doctorate in biology at Iowa State University, and my mom was a homemaker. Dad was a devout evolutionist. Mom was a devout Christian. So I grew up in the middle, trying to figure out where I belong.
So, folks, we need a question.
It's not a question, it's a statement.
Okay.
My statement is this is not going to be long. I finally found answers to my question. And I hope you have the courage to find this book, The Case for a Creator. It's a discussion of many of the things that we've been talking about tonight, but it's in layman's terms. I think it makes good sense. And I think it will help put to rest some of the questions you might have in your mind.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody have a question for either of our speakers? Yes, thank you very much. Who had their hand up first? I believe my friend here that arrived all at 5 o'clock or earlier had your hand up first.
Hi, my question's for Dr. Rana. You mentioned 60 years of prebiotic research in various labs. How is that any comparison to 700 million to a billion years of time in which we had a vast area on Earth of prebiotic soups and pools and volcanic vents? Doesn't that mean that up to a billion years could produce way more than than maybe a few acres of lab space over 60 years?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And my point would be that if chemistry is non-productive on the early Earth, it's non-productive no matter how long you give it. And so, so I don't see that time buys you anything in this particular scenario. It'd be one thing if you could say, yeah, the chemistry is actually productive, but I just don't see any evidence whatsoever that it's productive. So I don't see how time gets you around that. And by the way, when it comes to the timing for when life appeared on Earth, you have, well, there's an event called the Late Heavy Bombardment that happened at about 3.8, 3.9 billion years ago, and it's presumably the result of some kind of gravitational perturbation in the solar system with the gas giants migrating, and this is causing asteroids in the asteroid belt to pummel the inner solar system planets. And there is some thought that those impact events on the Earth would have been sterilization events, that if there was any life present, it would have been obliterated. It would have been a major frustration event for any kind of origin of life scenario, which in effect sets the clock back at t equals 0. Now, to be fair, there's controversy as to whether or not it is a complete sterilization event. Some people argue it only sterilized the surface of the Earth, and that if there was life in the subsurface, it may have survived. There's others who argue that it was a sterilization event both on the surface and the subsurface. So it's not really clear, but what's remarkable is that as soon as that event ends, that late heavy bombardment sequence ends, you have geochemical evidence at 3.8 billion years ago that suggests life was present, and much more compelling evidence at 3.5 billion years. So
you don't have as much time as you think you have for the origin of life to take place. It's arguably on a relatively short duration of time, and in fact, Stanley Miller himself argued that the maximum duration for the origin of life was 10 million years, not even 100 million years, based on cycling of the oceans through hydrothermal vents.
Good thing you're an old Earth creationist. that you can dismiss 10 million years. Yeah, 10
Another
million
question.
years is quite a bit of time.
Yes, sir. I think you had your hand up before, previously.
Yeah, I wrote this down earlier, so I'll just read it. It's sort of an ancillary area of what's going on here, but it's more or less a question about the climate of this debate, in general, not here tonight necessarily, but everywhere. In the United States, I should say, maybe in Europe too. It has been my understanding that the forum, I guess I'm using the realm of the university, because that's kind of where we hear about a lot of what I'm going to mention. It has been my understanding that the forum of the university is the bastion of the free exchange of ideas. I have learned of some instances where professors who ask, posit, and publicly ponder the concept or proposition of intelligent design, in some instances are blacklisted, ostracized, experience unpleasant atmospheres within the realm of academia. So my question regarding this is, why is there such an animosity toward the mere idea or speculation of intelligent design in the realm of academia? For example, loss of jobs, prestige, public shaming, and also shaming from one's academic peers. So I guess that's kind of, I was just sort of wondering, why is there such an animosity as opposed to simply a difference of opinion? There seems to be an emotional element that actually has effects on people's lives and livelihoods, etc. For both speakers.
Thank you. Whoever would
Okay,
like to...
who are you thinking of? Who's lost their job?
Well, probably the most public one has been obviously what was mentioned in the movie Expelled. But at the same time, I have occasionally, I don't have them here at reference, but over time I've seen some articles in newspapers, etc., where there has been an issue, a problem, a job was in jeopardy, etc. So my primary source would be what was revealed in the movie Expelled, but some other items too, which I don't have at my fingertips at this moment.
Okay, well, first of all, I'll tell you that your sources are not credible. I was in the movie Expelled, and it's really a disgraceful, terrible bit of propaganda that really spread a lot of lies about the academia. But on the one hand, it hasn't happened. You can't even name an example of where this has happened. I mean, I can think of a few who have lost their tenure, but losing tenure is a routine event. I lost tenure once when I was working at Temple University, and I didn't immediately say, oh, well, there's some grand conspiracy against evolutionists. So I think that's wrong. But also, there's a reality to it that one of the things we're doing in academia is we are trying to filter out incompetent kooks and people who can't do the job. And so if you've got somebody who's advancing a ludicrous idea in defiance of the evidence, then I think it's entirely appropriate for the university, through normal channels, to ask that they leave. They're not doing their job. This isn't simply a difference of opinion. This is a matter of competence in understanding the biology.
In response, if I could just respond in a question form.
Briefly.
Yeah, with regard to your colleague on the stage tonight, then basically the arguments he has presented, would you then deem him not capable because he posits the intelligent design argument? He would not be capable or should not be offered the opportunity to be a university professor in a biochemistry classroom teaching biochemistry. Are you following what you just said?
Yeah. again, I don't know all the details. When we evaluate somebody for tenure, there's a whole bunch of things that come into it. Maybe he'd be a really effective teacher. If you could go into a biochemistry classroom and teach biochemistry, I wouldn't have a problem. You can have whatever crazy ideas you want as long as you aren't trying to force them on the students. We also care that, well, you're doing productive research, that you're doing interesting things that lead to publications, that lead to public engagement, stuff like that. So, again, Dr. Rana might be perfectly fit for tenure at my university, and maybe I'd even vote for him if he were working there, even if he does hold these private beliefs. That's not a problem. A good example is Michael Behe, who's at Lehigh University. He is at Lehigh University. He is a tenured professor at Lehigh University. He's still there. He's still teaching. The faculty don't like him much, right? Because he's got some really wacky ideas, but he's still doing his job. So, there's not any kind of witch hunt against people like that unless their ideas interfere with the work that must be done at the university.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Rana, do you have a comment? Or?
Yeah, well, this may come as a surprise to you, but our organization actually would not endorse the movie Expelled when it came out. And I would agree with you. We felt like it was a gross mischaracterization of the scientific community at the university level. I do believe there probably are instances where there is somebody that is persecuted, on a university campus for religious beliefs. I know of a few people personally who had difficulties, but their job was never in jeopardy because they were very well respected. It was more of a Christian and an atheist kind of showdown type of thing, more so than anything else. But I know a lot of people through my work at Reasons to Believe who are faculty members at universities all over this country who are outspoken about their Christian beliefs, who give lectures on the university campus about science, faith issues, who are tenured and who are very well respected by the university community. It doesn't mean that they're people that don't like them, but they're very well respected. And it's because they're exceptional in their work as scientists. And so I think that's the critical thing. If you do a good job as a scientist, you're not going to be in jeopardy of losing your job because you espouse certain beliefs. I think also, and this is something that people may not want to hear, and again, it hasn't made us very popular at Reasons to Believe, but we actually don't think intelligent design belongs in the science classroom because right now there's not a scientific theory for intelligent design in spite of what some ID people claim. There's not a theory. And if you come to the table with a genuine theory for intelligent design and you show that that theory has evidential support, it will be, I believe it will be entertained by the scientific community. And, in my experience, I've always felt fairly treated by the scientific community as I've espoused my ideas. And I'll tell you a story. I wrote a book called Origins of Life, and one of the chapters in there deals with a critique of different models for the origin of cell membranes in an evolutionary sense. And I felt like we actually had something there that was a novel critique. And I actually worked with another chemist, and we wrote up a journal article that was a critical review of models for the origin of cell membranes. And I showed it to an Origin of Life researcher, I won't give you his name, who was one of the people whose work we most heavily criticized. And it's a long story how I wound up in contact with this person. And after I chatted with him about my ideas, he agreed to review the article. He came back to me, knowing that I worked for Reasons to Believe, and said, you need to publish this. Here's what you need to do to improve the paper. And then he actually advocated for me with the journal editor when I submitted the paper to the journal, and the journal editor came back and said, here's a few comments. We really want you to take these comments seriously, make these changes because we want to publish your paper. And I've actually seen this scientist reference my paper in subsequent work that he's done. He knew that I worked for Reasons to Believe. Okay, if there was ever an opportunity for somebody to engage in conspiracy, it would have been at that point, because they could have just shut down the submission to the journal, and they didn't. They actually advocated for me, even though I was critiquing their ideas, because they felt the critique actually had scientific merit. So I just have a hard time thinking that expelled is representative. And again, there very well could be instances where there's persecution that happens. But I think part of the problem is that, you know, as Christians, we feel like we've got such a strong case for design and that we want to advance it into science, and we're not willing to do the hard work that's needed to actually produce a genuine model. And until that happens, it doesn't belong in the science arena. It doesn't belong in science education at the high school level. I think it's perfectly fine to have these discussions, but these, at the end of the day, are philosophical discussions and theological discussions where science is informing the discussion. And I think that's perfectly fine. And I think that those kind of discussions are welcomed on a university campus, in my experience, if they're described in that way. And I think it's perfectly reasonable to offer criticisms of the evolutionary paradigm, or to point to places where we think that there's deficiencies there. That's part of science. I think that's a perfectly legitimate enterprise, and it's welcomed if it's done in the right way.
Thank you.
Okay, but you must tell me the name of those biologists so we can hunt him down.
Yeah.
No, but I agree completely, and I should mention too that, you know, for instance, several of the scientists that he cited in his talk, like Simon Conway Morris, Paul Davies, are very well esteemed in their fields. They're very highly regarded, and they're also very sympathetic to religion. Conway Morris, to such an extent that I've argued with him ferociously several times about this, and he doesn't like me anymore. So, you know, there is no Christian atheist battle going on in the campus. I'm probably the most out atheist in my department. I would say probably half the faculty there are church-going. None of them are fundamentalist. None of them are very, very vigorous about it, but they do go regularly to church. And if I were to somehow speak out against a candidate and say, we have to reject him because he's not an atheist, I would get lynched. I would be investigated for whether I was fit to be a contributing member of the faculty.
Okay, thank you. This gentleman and front row there.
Probably not the most analytical question in the world, but I've noticed you do not seem to like analogies. You have spoken down about all the analogies that have been mentioned thus far, but the first thing you ever said in your opening statement felt like an analogy to me.
It was.
Why exactly was that?
Yeah, well, I'm not down on analogies. I think an analogy is a useful instructional tool to help people see some particular pattern. It removes a lot of the biases that you have about a pre-existing situation. So it's kind of a useful tool. But analogies also have limitations. I would not use, you've all heard of overextending an analogy. So you would not keep going with it. I would not say, oh, well, this debate with life is like a painting, and therefore life is made of pigments. No, that would be silly. So you've got to know where to draw the line.
So you mentioned your analogy that you said you believe the painting was made by this painter, and that we believe, fictionally, that the person you would be speaking with would believe that, no, it wasn't made by the painter, it was made by some fictional person who doesn't really exist. Well, I kind of sit here and think that, well, I believe that this painting would be made by the painter, and the fictional person I would be asking thinks that it was just, you know, unearthed just as it was by some archaeologist out there and said, well, this just came to be because there's another painting, and those two paintings got together and made a baby painting out of that.
Okay.
I don't feel that it's going the right direction, personally. I feel that, you know, we have people who document
That's
about
okay.
God's existence.
But that's where that's where the analogy actually becomes useful, because I can tell you that's about as ridiculous an idea as the idea that it was poofed into existence by a supernatural agent. we don't believe that paintings replicate, that they don't mate, all these sorts of things. So that's where the analogy falls apart, and we say, okay, you can't push it that far.
All right, that's good.
We are running out of time, so I'm going to give due preference to the front row here.
All right, real quick to Dr. Rana. You seem to believe that creation or the world is evidence of the Creator. If that is the case, why does he hate us? Look outside, frozen hellscape. The only reason we're here is because people came before us and built this building and built our apartments and shipped oil in and dug minerals out of the ground to make the industry that makes it possible. It was all us. Why does he hate us? Why is our environment so unsuited for us?
He doesn't
Is
hate
Fargo
people.
that bad?
He doesn't hate people, he just hates Fargo.
I guess I'm having a difficulty seeing how your reasoning is working there. I mean, because I would actually take a different view, that I would look at the earth as being endowed with an abundance of resources that are available for us to use. You know, so yeah, I mean, you know, I mean, I could give you a biblical perspective on why, you know, on your question, if that's permissible. Okay, well, I mean, because the idea is that when we were created, we were human beings. Adam and Eve were Adam was, and Eve was later created in the Garden of Eden. And the idea was that the Garden of Eden was this place that was under control, whereas the rest of the world was out of, you know, essentially a wild place, and that the intent was for mankind to, as they multiplied and filled the earth, was to take the Garden of Eden and bring order throughout the planet. So it's, you know, we're to subdue the creation and bring it under our control. And so that's what the intent was. But the idea was that we were co-participants with the Creator in transforming the planet.
I guess I'm saying, if the evidence is creation, it's not evidence of the benevolent Creator God of Christians. I could see maybe Spinoza's God, where we're just sort of gut bacteria that happen to be here inside God's belly, sort of. But it doesn't seem that the evidence fits the theory that there is benevolent Creator God. I don't see how you make that.
Well, I mean, in Christian theology, we see the processes that are happening here on earth are part of God's providence. But the expectation is that we are playing a role in taking what's available to us and using it for our benefit, and really the benefit of all life on the planet. That's the biblical mandate. So I don't see how that challenges God's benevolence. I'm not seeing the connection there. Sorry, I just not.
Folks, we have actually run out of time, so I'm going to have to. What time do you have, Greg? 9:30. We are very much out of time. Let's give our speakers a hand and thank them for being here. And I'm sure that they are willing to stick around just to answer. I know some of you had questions. You want to please stick around. Is it okay, gentlemen, just for a little bit here?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, as long as we can go somewhere where there's beer.
So let's, closing statement, whether you believe it or not, God loves you. Go in peace. Thank you for coming.